Yeah.
Where's Bob? Is he going to sit by himself? Here, I'll let you sit and I'll keep my watch. I can't. I will try to. You have to hold it down.
Well, and I can provide a signal of some sort.
Yeah.
But I know you're used to this kind of thing, so I always like to keep my own time and my own
Right.
doing
I'll take 7 o'clock.
That's why I usually just, I offer to phone today.
Yeah. You don't need to do that.
Couple of minutes, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for taking your seats so we can get the food served. Okay. All right. Great turnout. So let me say, as always, hello, Tiger Bay. Hello. I'm so glad to see all of you here on this beautiful, beautiful day. They're trying to serve the lunch so we can get a start and then have our full attention for our speaker. But before we get too deep into lunch, would you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Well, this is the last 2012 Tiger Bay meeting. The next time we meet will be February 2013. As you may recall, we don't meet in January. We have 11 meetings a year starting in February. So don't be upset if you don't get a January meeting notice. Nobody's dropped you off the list. And we're working very hard to put together a great program for 2013, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you and many of your friends at next year's meetings. We did change our meeting date. It now is set for the second Thursday. It's the second Thursday of every month. If you want to make note on your calendar, you can put them in February through December, second Thursday at the pier. We may have a couple of meetings off-site from here, but let's just assume this is our primary location. I really appreciate your attention. It's time to re-up. New members can join for $100. Anyone can rejoin or renew for $100. We now have corporate membership, which means a corporation or a group or an organization of any sort can pay $300 in annual membership and send any 3 people. So in other words, if you join as an individual, that's your membership. It's not transferable. If you join as a corporation, any 3 members of your corporation can get registered for our meetings. I have to tell you that it was so exciting to me when I called Dan Miller and asked him if he would be our speaker for this meeting, because I'm a big fan of Dan's and have been for years. I think Dan represents the kind of politician that we all wish there were more of. For the most part, they're few and far between anymore. But in the years that Dan served as our congressman, regardless of your party, Dan served honorably. Dan served with great civility. I never heard an unpleasant, nasty word come out of his mouth. He served with integrity and great intelligence. He understands the issues that he's involved in. He doesn't talk about things that he doesn't understand. And to me, I think that he represents kind of the penultimate kind of person that we'd love to see representing us, and we'd like to see them representing this country. I asked Dan to talk about the fiscal cliff, not knowing where we would be at the time in the national discussion. But I think it's, even though you've probably heard more about it than you've ever dreamed you'd hear about it, if you watch cable news at all, most of us are still wondering what the heck is actually going on. Because most of what we hear is posturing, political talking points, blatant misrepresentations, whatever you want to call it, on every side of this discussion. And what Dan brings to us today is he brings a great intelligence. He brings his experience on the Appropriations Committee when he was in Congress, and he brings the ability to talk about complex things in ways that all of us can understand. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to introduce Dan Miller.
Very nice.
That was a very nice introduction. Thank you. You've, I hope you haven't raised expectations too much. When you first called me about doing this, I think I was in North Carolina at the time, but it was, I'm going to leave my watch up here so I can see keep track of time. I wasn't sure this was a Tiger Bay type of event or subject, to be kind of an informational one, more of a, almost like a lecture or something. I'm getting ready to teach a class in it at USF on the fiscal cliff starting in January. But you know, Tiger Bay is more, I always thought, of panel discussions, you know, controversial public policy issues. And I'm just delighted Manatee County has one, because all the time in Congress I was very involved in the one in Sarasota. But it was always a panel, and so this is kind of unique. So I hope it works out. And you know, I question whether you really want to do that. Judy assured me that the program committee said let's do it. So we'll see. I'm going to talk, and I hope when you leave here today you have a better grasp of what's happening in the whole fiscal picture of Washington than when you came in here. I'm going to talk about the fiscal cliff, but the fiscal cliff is really just a step. It's just something to force Congress to address the real complex issues of our federal budget. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the cliff because we're going to solve the cliff problems. The challenge is, and the reason Congress created the cliff, is to force Congress to make the tough decisions to get our fiscal house in order. The fiscal problems of this country are immense. They're unsustainable, and we've got to do something about it. We've got to address entitlement spending. We've got to address the tax system, discretionary spending. We have to address it all, and Congress keeps putting it off. And so they've created this cliff, and what the cliff is, it's the tax cuts that were originally passed in 2001 by Bush, and I was in Congress and we voted for those. When we voted for those in 2001, it was before 9/11, that was the fourth year in a row of a surplus in the federal budget. That was the fourth year in a row of a surplus, and the projections at that time were $5 trillion of surpluses in the next 10 years. And that's how the tax cuts got passed. They're mainly middle-class tax cuts, not tax cuts just for the wealthy. So they got passed in 2001. Things changed after 9/11. We went into a little recession. Defense spending has doubled in the past 10 years. Congress has passed unfunded entitlement spending, the Medicare Part D prescription drug program pushed by the Republicans. Was never funded, for example. We had the recession. So this has all brought us into this situation where spending is in effect out of control, the mandatory spending, and we need to look at the revenue side of the equation too. In addition to this fiscal cliff, in addition to the tax cuts, which is a major part of it, we have the FICA tax cut that was passed 2 years ago. It's a 2% cut in your payroll taxes. So everybody got a 2% reduction in payroll taxes for the employee, not the employer. And that was for a stimulus for the recession. There's kind of, I think, a quiet agreement in Washington that's going to expire, and the FICA taxes are not part of this fiscal debate, and they'll go back to where they were in 2010. The other part of it is, if you remember, last summer, summer of 2011, there was a fight over raising the debt ceiling. And that issue is getting ready to come up again in a couple of months, the debt ceiling. And as part of the agreement between the Republicans in Congress, in the House in particular, and President Obama, was he put some real good controls on discretionary spending, but they also created a super committee of 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, half House, half Senate, to come up with a plan to address entitlement spending and revenues. And they were going to draft this legislation. It would go directly to the floor of the House and Senate, no amendments, voted on, and then signed into law. If they didn't pass it, they had this $100 billion of sequestration, which is across-the-board spending cuts that will take effect on 1st of January, the 2nd of January. Nobody, liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, want sequestration. Across-the-board cuts, it just doesn't work from a practical standpoint. It may sound good, but it doesn't. Sequestration was really started in the concept back in the 1980s when they got Graham-Rudman-Hollins bill. It was never used, but it's the threat of it because no one wants it to happen. So anyway, that's part of this fiscal cliff, is all these things are going to happen on January 1st or 2nd. In reality, it's more of a slope. It doesn't all take effect on January 1 or 2. I mean, just the withholding alone, for example, you got to get withholding tables, you got to get your payroll processing changed over. So I don't think IRS has issued new, withholding tables and such. So it's going to be kind of a phase-in of a problem. The spending cuts are over 9 months, and they can kind of defer a lot of the spending to cuts to the summer and hopefully have the money replaced. So in theory, not much is going to happen on January 1st or 2nd or so, unless there's a psychological effect that the stock market collapses and all that. But the process is to force a decision on how to address entitlement spending. So what I want to do now is I want to talk about talk about the federal budget overall. I want to talk about the budget process, because once we get through the cliff, we've got to go through this budget process next year addressing taxes and entitlements. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics of Washington, the extreme partisanship that takes place there, and I will conclude with some thoughts of what will be included in the final package. The federal budget, and this is my first of my charts, these were color charts, and it's so expensive to copy color, they came out in black and white, of course. But at the bottom, you have a pie chart that just shows that the overall federal budget is $3.6 trillion. It's hard to even imagine what a trillion is. I mean, a billion is such a huge number, it's hard to understand a billion, let alone a trillion. But $3.6 trillion, one way to kind of relate to it is it's about $12,000 for every man, woman, and child in this country is spent by the federal government. That's the spending. We're about a $1 trillion deficit this past year, so the revenues were about $2.6 trillion. When you look at that chart and you start saying, how do you come about getting our fiscal house in order? You look at the big numbers. Who was the famous bank robber that said, Willie Sutton. Why do you keep robbing banks? Now, that's where the money is. Well, if you look at this pie chart, you see the big money is in defense, $700 billion. Most of that's discretionary, by the way. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. That's where the big dollars are. Interest on the national debt is not too high right now in a way because interest rates are so low. But the big money is going to be in the entitlements. When you look at the federal budget, it's divided into 2 major parts. You've got mandatory spending, and then you have the discretionary spending. This can be a boring subject to get into, but the next 2 charts give you some outline of what mandatory is in there, and the discretionary. And so about 65% of the budget is mandatory spending, and the other 35% is discretionary. By the discretionary means every year Congress has to appropriate that money. And I served on the Appropriations Committee for 8 years. I served on the Budget Committee, which puts the budget together, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the discretionary amount of money, that's what goes to pay for the National Park Service. It pays for Head Start. It pays for all the defense spending. So you can see the different categories: veterans, foreign aid. Foreign aid is $53 billion a year. That's a lot. On a $3.6 trillion budget, $53 billion is, I think, 1.5% or something like that. When you get to mandatory spending, that third chart, you'll see it's $700 billion Social Security, Medicare, and just round numbers, $450 billion and such. And the next chart shows that in the next 25 years, average revenues of the federal government have been about 18–19% of GDP. Spending is a little bit more than that. It's that top chart on page 1. If the revenues stay at 18–19%, all federal revenues will go to mandatory spending, and there'll be nothing left for defense, education, health issues, veterans, and all the other discretionary parts of the federal budget. And I put another chart in there on number 5. Ed Jennings and I have been talking about this. Actually, it made me think about including that one. It just shows that, there's a lot of it's the aging of America. But besides the aging of America and the baby boomers who are just entering the retirement age right now, it's the whole area of increased cost of health care. That's where the money is. I put on the bottom of page 4 short definitions, just so we clarify those. We hear about CBO and OMB. OMB and CBO. OMB is the Office of Management and Budget. That is the head of the OMB is a cabinet level position in the federal government. It's the president's budget office. So the president directs what OMB does. CBO is the Congressional Budget Office. But CBO is a much more nonpartisan organization, surprisingly. As partisan as Congress is, CBO is not. It's a very professional group of people. The head of the CBO is appointed by the Speaker of the House and the majority. It happens to be a Democrat right now, but it doesn't really matter. It's got high standards, and they do the economic analysis, and they do something called scoring. Scoring is where you project what the cost. If you raise capital gains from 15% to 20%, the score is how much revenue it generates to the federal government. It works on a static basis. But anyway, those are the two things. Then sequestration, I've talked about. That's automatic spending cuts. And then reconciliation, we're going to hear. I'll talk about it in a minute. There's an interesting article by Robert Samuelson that it was earlier this week. I like Robert Samuelson. It's from the Washington Post. He's a columnist. It looks like it's an anti-Obama column, but it really has some good information in it, saying you got to address entitlements. That for Republicans, the hang-up is raising taxes, but for the Democrats, the hang-up is touching entitlements. And so he provides a lot of good information about that. Let me go into the budget process. So I'm moving kind of quickly through this. Congress, do we have iced tea, Judy? Congress started a budget process in 1974 when they first started a budget committee. And the way it works is, and as I say, I spent 4 years on that committee. John Kasich was the top Republican on it, but Paul Ryan was a staffer working on that committee when I first served on the committee in '93. And it's a different committee, by the way, for Congress. You're only allowed to serve on it for 6 years. I was on it because I was on appropriations, automatically got a couple of seats on it. But the way it works is the president submits a detailed budget on about February 1 of every year. A few thousand pages, very detailed. It comes from the OMB, but it's the president's budget. The House and Senate budget committees then are supposed to develop their own separate budgets and pass them. And the House and Senate, the budgets coming out of the House and Senate budget committees are essentially one-page documents. They don't provide any details. They'll say defense spending, $600 billion, education, $80 billion, or something. So they'll just have a series of numbers for discretionary spending in there. And so the House and Senate pass their bills, and they usually pass it right before, they're supposed to, right before the Easter recess. Congress works on deadlines. And they have all these breaks. Like at Easter, they'll take it's called a district work period. And that you're going home the week before Easter and maybe the week after Easter. And so right before you go, they kind of make you force and make tough votes and take those votes. So they want you to do one right before Easter to do the budget. House and Senate pass it. Then you have to have a conference committee of House and Senate budget people come together. They'll get a compromise budget between the House and Senate, and it should be passed before they go home for the Memorial Day break. And then based on that, then the Appropriations Committee, it doesn't go to the President. That's all it does with the Budget Committee. The Budget Committee only does one thing, pass a budget. Then the Appropriations Committee now has their numbers to work with to come up with how much money they can spend on education. And yeah, I was on a committee that did Commerce, Justice, and State, for example. The Commerce Department has the Census Bureau, Economic Research. I had the Labor Department, Bureau of Labor Statistics. They come ask for money every year, and you'd have to give them money. I'm not a lawyer, but I'd have 2 Supreme Court justices come every year asking for money to fund the Supreme Court because it all had to go through the Appropriations Committee. And it was always fun quizzing a Supreme Court justice and not know anything about the law. But that's the way the process worked. Now, the mandatory spending is just kind of automatic. I mean, you don't have to do anything in Congress. It's going to be spent. My Social Security check is going to go in the mail or into my bank every month, regardless of what Congress as such does. The only way it changes is a separate piece of legislation which can be filibustered in the Senate. But there is a process within the Budget Committee process called reconciliation. And the reconciliation will probably be used next year. And the way you do reconciliation is the Budget Committee can put instructions in the budget and say, Ways and Means Committee find $50 billion more cuts in Medicare. It can tell the Ways and Means Committee, find $100 billion of cuts, increases in taxes. You say the Agriculture Committee find $5 billion cuts in automatic spending under the Agriculture Bill. So reconciliation can be used, and the way it works is you can give instructions to the committees how much money they have to work with. They can then prepare a bill that is one big reconciliation bill with agriculture in and Medicare in and Social Security in and taxes all in, and it'll come up for a single vote. It's been used a few times. It was used by Bill Clinton back in 1993 when he had his tax increases. It was used by Bush in 2001 when he did these. Actually, it was even used for Obamacare and the taxes when Obama first went in 2009, 2010. So, but unfortunately, it's only good for 10 years, and that's the reason these Bush tax cuts, by the way, are expiring at the end of 10 years. They were used under reconciliation. So reconciliation will probably get used next year. Okay. Let me move on kind of quickly here and go into the politics of what's happening in Washington right now. It's people ask me, do you miss it up there? I say, yeah, I miss it, but I'm sure glad, I'm not there. I mean, you miss being part of a process, but Jesus, doesn't look like much fun anymore up there. Right now is definitely no fun in the month of December up there because there's no hearings going on, there's not much happening. Most people are changing, half the Congress is changing offices, stuff's piled all over everywhere. You got 70 members of Congress who don't even have offices anymore because they're retiring or got defeated. And they have a lottery of offices that takes place after the election, so based on seniority, and people change offices, frequently. And you got 70 new members of the House getting ready to be sworn in on January 3. So part of the problem right now is, this is a lame duck session, and whatever they do today doesn't force the next Congress to abide by. So it's a much trickier time to resolve this fiscal cliff than we'd expect. There are the next Congress have 234 Republicans and 200 Democrats. It takes 218 votes in the House. That's the key number to get anything done in Washington is 218 votes in the House. Where do you get 218 votes? I can't imagine anything that President Obama would sign would get 218 Republican votes. The House is now extremely partisan. It's a very liberal group of Democrats and a very conservative group of Republicans. And there are not many moderate Democrats left. There are not many moderate Republicans left. I was just in Canada teaching a few weeks ago up in Ottawa and Kingston, and they have a parliamentary system. And I spent 3 days working with a retired member of the Parliament teaching. And there you have party cohesion. You better stick the party line. In our system, we're all elected as individual representatives. Vern Buchanan is our congressman here. He got elected with 54% of the vote last month. President Obama got 45% of the vote. Now, I haven't talked to Vern about specifically this, but he's got 54% of people elected him, and 45% of the people elected Obama in the area. What does he follow? And his district is considered a purple district, closer than most members in the House. Of the 435 members, 75% of them got elected with more than 60% of the vote. I was looking at one set of numbers. Jeff Miller is a congressman from the Panhandle of Florida, which is Pensacola, the big military base, a lot of retired military, a lot of Southern conservatives. He won with 70% of the vote, and Obama got 30% of the vote. Now, for him, how does he vote? I mean, he got elected by 70% of the people with a conservative philosophy. Nancy Pelosi from San Francisco, by the way, I've been to a party at her house one time, and I can assure you she lives like a Republican. I was out there actually with other members of Congress, and she was lobbying us actually. I was on the Interior Appropriation Committee that funds the National Park Service, and there's a Presidio there, and there's the old military base, and it was how it's being processed into the private sector and a quasi-public-private thing, and some other military bases closing, and so it was really the role of the National Park and organize, how they spend money. But anyway, that's details of what an appropriation committee does. So the thing is, her district, I bet you she won with 90% of the vote, and Obama got 90% of the vote in her district. So most people are elected under those circumstances. There's only about 20% of the people that get elected with less than 55% of the vote. So that makes it all the harder to get people to vote to get a compromise in. Though this is just simple arithmetic of it. Let me talk about some of the options we're facing now, and then we'll open it up for questions. The cliff option is not to do anything, but there's discussion. One option right now that's I think getting a lot of discussion is tax rates on the wealthy are going up. I mean, there's no question about it, and the Republicans are in a weak position debating this issue with President Obama. Polls show the public strongly supports the concept of raising taxes on the rich. So that's going to happen. And so one option they have that's being talked about is the Senate's already passed the bill to keep the tax cuts in for the 98% and let it go up for the 2%. Is just to take up that bill, do something about sequester in there with an amendment, and let people vote on it. And Republicans can just vote present or just not show up that day. Because there's not going to be 218 votes of Republicans to vote for that. And then the question is, will the Democrats do that? The real cliff is coming up. We have two big issues that really are cliffs, and that is the debt ceiling is coming up again in February or March, and then the appropriations. The appropriations, that discretionary spending is a 12-month thing. Our fiscal year is October 1 to September 30th. They only funded a 6-month appropriation, so on April 1 they need money or the government shuts down. If you don't appropriate the money, the government really does shut down. If you remember back in 1995 when Republicans took control of Congress, we were having a fight over the budget with Bill Clinton, and we actually did shut down, DeSoto National Park had to close, and so did the Washington Monument and the Smithsonian Museums, all the parts of government. Only people that could work are absolutely essential people. I mean, that doesn't mean everybody, the FBI. Actually, a little side story, I don't want to go too long. When they shut down, the White House had to close down, and you can't voluntarily go to work during, when there's no money to pay it. So the secretaries can't work. And so it was at this time that interns had to do a lot more work at the White House. This is really true. The most famous intern of the White House was doing work with the president, which would not normally be the case because all the non-essential people were not able to work. So there is, maybe one option is to, but one other little story about Monica Lewinsky is many of you know I fought the sugar program big time. And the big fight on sugar was in the early of 95 and 96. Chuck Schumer, now the senator, was my partner on it. The two of us were fighting it together. I was, strange bedfellows. But, and so at any rate, there's some famous sugar people in Florida, two brothers. One's a big Democrat, one's a big Republican. They give a lot of money. And after they made the deposition available on Monica Lewinsky, it turned out one time she was in the Oval Office and a guy named Pepe called the president, and he got through to the president of the United States 2 weeks before they were voting on my sugar bill to try to fight my sugar bill. That's really having influence in Washington to get to the president of the United States when he's occupied. So let me talk about some of the. So there may be a package. What's going to be in a final package is going to make people like Bob Christopher's partners really happy, because the last time we had a major tax change was in 1986. So it's going to be a raise in the rates. There's going to be a lot of possible changes in deductions and how they're treated. There's going to be more means testing of programs. We already started means testing, and Republicans are big supporters of means testing. Medicare, we already means test Medicare Part B. Something that's going to be talked about is the changing the CPI, the chained CPI, the Consumer Price Index. That's one that I think is going to be in a final package. And it's even possible that one could even get in and be part of the deal to get over the fiscal cliff, because it's kind of an issue that no one really sees it directly. The CPI is, is built into everything in the government now. My Social Security gets increased every year by the CPI. But it's not, it really gives you a little bit more money than you need. For example, if the price of beef goes up $1 a pound, does that mean everybody pays $1 a pound more for beef? No, you go buy chicken or pork or something else. And so a better analysis, treatment of what CPI is something called a chain CPI. You can also have different CPIs for elderly people. Have a different CPI than John Neal's generation has as a CPI. We spend different money on different things at a different age. So changing the CPI affects things like Social Security big time. It'll probably lower about 0.25%. So it doesn't sound like a huge amount of money. But when you have 40 million people on Social Security, 0.25% less a year, it adds up. But it also affects tax bracket creep, and things like that are built in there, Bob. So it really does generate some more revenue to the federal government, because they don't raise that level up there. So there's a lot of areas to do that. So I think we'll see that in there. I think there are going to be some efforts to lower corporate taxes, by the way. Well, I think I've gone over my limit. So let me just go to questions. I mean, there's a lot of things I can go into, and I've covered a lot. It's obviously very complex. I had the pleasure of being four years on that budget committee and then 8 years on appropriations, and I enjoy teaching this too. But it's a lot to cover, and I hope I don't leave you more confused. But let me just let you decide what direction you want to go with questions. However we're going to do
Our questions, people walk to the microphone, announce their name, and say they're members of Tiger Bay.
Okay.
So, come on up, Karen.
My name is Karen Grablin. I'm a Tiger Bay member. Thank you, Dan, for that presentation. You may not be physically representative of a panelist, but with your knowledge of the subject as well as your experience in Washington, it's very valuable information. A couple of thoughts. I'm sure you hear these questions all the time, and they're not significant relative to Social Security and Medicare being such a big part of the budget, but they kind of stick in everybody's craw about cuts that maybe could be looked at, such as, well, I don't know if it's a cut or not. I've seen it many times that the Congress, as I understand it, has their own retirement system. They have their own health insurance system, separate from the rest of us. And that seems to be a disconnect with the rest of the population. I don't know that that would result in any savings, but if they were subject to the same rules as us, that might might create some more compromise and some ability to cut. Also things like, I always see that, well, we want to cut, but it doesn't seem like there's administratively cuts that happen in Washington. In other words, maybe you get by with one less aide, or the guy that cleans the floors in the Capitol building on the third shift doesn't come into work, or things like that. And the third has to do with things like crop subsidies. I mean, you hear about so many even big business farmers getting paid not to farm. I mean, that's, to me, just wasted money. So I know that's not significant, but they do have a PR impact, and I just have you comment on that.
Great.
Please.
Let me comment on all three of those. You want to cut my congressional pension?
Yeah.
Actually, the congressional pension system, the health care is essentially the same as any federal employee. I'm on Medicare Part A, Part B, like anybody else of my age. And my supplemental I buy as a federal employee is the same as a National Park Service person or something to pay for. It's not a super-duper Cadillac plan, but I'm happy with it and such. My pension, by the way, the pension system was changed back in 1984. I think we should, as private sector does, go all towards a defined contribution away from a defined benefit plan. But for 10 years of Congress, it's public information, I get about $20,000 a year. I'm delighted with that $20,000, but I'm saying is some people think you serve 2 years and you get a lifetime salary or something like that. It was 10 years, and now the longer you serve, you can get more. People entering Congress prior to 1984 got a much more generous pension system. So basically, we're in the same system as everyone else. But as far as cutting government, the Simpson-Bowles, I didn't take time to talk about that, but that had an across-the-board cut of 10%. Discretionary spending is where that is. And I think we've seen they had a $1 trillion agreement in the debt ceiling debate last year to start lowering that. And so you're right, they need to lower the overall area of government workforce. They want to, as I say, Simpson-Bowles recommended a 10% across the board cut. Agriculture has to be on the table, and that's going to be part of the debate. It's interesting how agriculture. My answers get too long, but let me give you politics of agriculture. In the agricultural appropriation, how do you pass an agricultural appropriation bill? Because there's maybe 100 members of Congress have agriculture in the district. My area, we have tomatoes, but tomatoes don't get the subsidies that cotton and everyone else had. What they do is they load up in the agriculture department all the food stamps and school nutrition programs. So what they do to get the votes, and why liberals like agriculture programs, is because of all the money for nutrition programs. That's how politics works. But anyway, it's got to be on the table, and everybody's talking about seriously cutting agriculture subsidies. Bob.
Good afternoon, Dan, and thank you for coming. I'm a member, Bob Christopher. I have seen studies over the last 30, 40 years that regardless of the tax rates, we raise 19% of GDP in revenue, as you just stated. Also, a lot of the appropriation reductions don't ever take effect. So although we score things on a static model, as you said, we really live in a dynamic world. And I understand why we have to score on a static model. But how are we going to really close the annual deficit?
The what deficit?
Annual deficit.
Oh, well, I think some of changing the CPI, for example, has a big cumulative impact on it. There's talk about raising the retirement age on Medicare. Now with Obamacare, people can buy insurance up to age 67. Now, what it does, it shifts costs to the younger age group, so you could raise that age. Means testing. For people over a certain income, they would not get a CPI increase on Social Security, for example. For wealthy people, there's no reason they should get any subsidy on Medicare. Medicare, on average, subsidizes a senior about $5,000 a year. Why should we be substituting, wealthy Ross Perot millionaires and such? So, but they have to control discretionary spending. That's what was nice about the Simpson-Bowles proposal. By the way, one good source for anybody looking to learn more about all this is Wikipedia. I mean, it really has some pretty good information that keeps it pretty relatively simple, but enough details in there. But it's going to be a cumulative things from agriculture subsidies. You're right, discretionary is it's hard to manage. But they did claim they're going to get $1 trillion. But every year you have to pass a new appropriation bill, and every 2 years you have a new Congress, and so you can't force. It's like forcing this Congress to force what happens on January 3. And so but the big change has to be in entitlement spending. I mean, that's where the money is. That's where the money is entitlement spending and defense. There's no reason defense is as high as it is today. It's doubled since 2001. The United States spends more money than the next 17 countries in the world combined in spending. We spend more than Russia and China and Israel and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Britain and everybody else combined. Now, we all want strong national defense, but it's got to be a big number on the table right there, too. So once they get serious and kind of force it out, that's what they're going to have to do. Davis?
Hi, I'm Davis Graham. I'm a member. I've been enjoying the book, The Forgotten Man, which I read a while back. And in there, they talk about Mellon's getting us out of debt during World War I. He basically leveled the tax so that everybody across the board was taxed. and the highest tax was 24%. Why would not this work in today's environment?
Well, we have a $3.6 trillion budget to start with, so the money is so much more dramatically different. Back in those days, we didn't have all the entitlement programs of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and so just the numbers are just so dramatically different. Over the years, we've made our tax code much more progressive, and so only about 50% of the people pay taxes anymore on income taxes. The payroll tax, of course, is a regressive tax, and that's the more punishing one. But you know, a simplified tax code, I think everybody wants to move towards. There's wide agreement that our tax system, the last time it was changed was in '86, a major change. It needs to be revised because we're in a global economy. We're not able to compete as well as other countries. And you know, a lot of people say we should go to a VAT tax, a value-added tax, some type of consumption tax. I think that's probably too dramatic for Congress to do. But at any rate, Dave Camp, who is the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, who, by the way, vacations out in Longboat Key every spring. His mother-in-law lives out there. And Max Baucus, the senator who's the chairman of the Finance Committee in the Senate, are two really highly respected, knowledgeable people that, you know, they've got their ideas. And so it's going to take them a year. That's what's going to be happening. We go through this budget process and through reconciliation. The Ways and Means Committee has has all jurisdiction over taxes, but also over most entitlements. And so they will come up with their plans during the year and get it in a reconciliation bill. So I think they want to move towards a simpler tax system, but when only 50% of the people pay, and you've got a $3.6 trillion budget, it's not going to get much smaller. It's just going to go higher.
Just a follow-up to that, I was walking on the way over, and Mrs. Childs always taught me that volunteering was good help, but to pay somebody. And the same way with entitlements, if only 50% are paying taxes, if everybody participated, then they would recognize those entitlements as something worthy. Do you understand? So,
but you know, it's a different world we're in today, and the expectations are, don't touch my Social Security. And but you know, I remember back in '95 when Republicans took over and we were pushing to try to restrain the growth in spending in Medicare. You're not going to cut Medicare spending, you just want to slow it down. Back then it was like 13, 14% a year, and we're just trying to get it down to 8 or 9% a year. And then you got attacked, oh, you're going to cut Medicare. You weren't cutting it. And Obama's not cutting Medicare. They're just slowing the rate of growth down, and because we have an aging population, and that's another factor, you know, in the whole equation. Davis, I first met, well, no, I met him before, but used to run Florida House up on Capitol Hill when I was there in '93 and '4. Hey, John?
My name's John Neal. I'm a Tiger Bay member. I just wanted to ask a question. You didn't touch at all just until you were questioning on the sacred cow of the current administration, the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. I have my own opinions on it. Actually, I saw a bumper sticker on the way over here. It said something like, Obamacare, all the service of the DMV and the compassion of the IRS, you know. But which is sort of how it's looked at, but it's clearly an entitlement. I just was wondering what the impact, what impact you feel like. That could be a whole other meeting, but just briefly, what do you think?
Well, it's a good question, and I've been thinking that too. But you see very little discussion about it because most of it is not going to get ready to be implemented until starting to next year. And they have a significant cut in Medicare spending out of that goes to pay the cost of it. And so the question is, how do they implement it? And they got this special panel that's supposed to make these across-the-board cuts. So I don't know if anyone has plugged those numbers fully into that whole debate. Is how do you what is the full impact of that on the spending thing? It's not going to cut spending. Every time, you know, like in the stimulus bill they passed back in 2009, there was a lot of money for physicians to go to computerize their medical records and such. And the idea is it's going to save a lot of money. It makes sense to me it would, but anyway, that's part of the stimulus bill. So there's a lot of things they're trying to do. We're finding Blake Hospital now owns Pinnacle and that other place there on Cortez Road, and I think Manatee Hospital is buying places. You know, it's a fragmented system. I'm not sure. No one has the right answer to solve the health care problem, but there's no question we spend too much total dollars, and a lot of people here in this room are, you know, are impacted by it. But You know, there's no easy answer to that solution, but, and I'm not sure Obamacare does it. I mean, it's, but, you know, we passed it. We passed the prescription drug bill. I wasn't in Congress, but I mean, you can't vote against something like that when it comes to the floor of the House. And it gets passed, and no way to pay for these things. That, you know, one of the things about how you scoring, we talk about scoring and how, you know, how you play the game in this issue. And I'll give you a couple of little stories about how you play the game with money. In the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, there was a Ted Kennedy wanted something for long-term care in there, and so they put the long-term care provision in the bill, and it was actually going to generate money to the federal government. It was a net positive because it was a 10-year projection you work on, and it wasn't going to go into effect for about 3 years or 4 years, and then you couldn't start claiming any of the benefits until you've paid into the system for 3, 4, 5 years. So what it was going to be a lot of revenue flowing into the system, and the real money was in the second decade of the thing. And so they put it in there, and that gave like $150 billion yet more to spend. So the bottom line is, you know, and then they since realized it won't work. There's no money in it, and they can't do it, so it's already been discarded. I mean, on budget issues, I remember this was on NIH. Republicans were a big supporter of biomedical research, and there was kind of an agreement back in the 90s to double the size of NIH spending. Most money flows to university research centers and such. And so Clinton and Republicans were pretty much in agreement, let's double NIH spending. And so the budget comes out, and they had a 0% increase for NIH spending. And so I remember Donna Chile, I was on the committee that she was the secretary of HHS at the time, and we just gave her all kinds of heck. Well, how can you double NIH spending over a 5-year period, and you're saying 0 increase this year? And she had a very weak answer. But the politics of it, David Broder wrote a column about it, I remember, and about Ted Kennedy complaining to Clinton. And Clinton said, I don't need to worry about NIH. Republicans will take care of increasing NIH. So he put all the money in the Labor Department programs, and so Republicans were forced into this situation as, do you cut labor or do you increase NIH? I mean, there's a lot of games played in the scoring and in how they do the budget. But at any rate, John. Okay, thank you. Okay.
I'm Wileen Graham, and I am a member. I had one comment was you mentioned the electronic medical records. A number of years ago, when they were starting the process of creating this how many page document on the healthcare, they said one of the consultants they used was a physician up in Massachusetts. I know he published in the New England Journal of Medicine, but he said the electronic records process is a great face to put on this. This will be something that will sell the product. And so I think that's one thing. The other thing is to really look at what the service is going to offer. No mammos until you're 50 years old, all sorts of things. So people, when they talk about it, really need to investigate what all it covers. My question, though, is about entitlements. And what are entitlements? Because right away I hear mention of the Social Security. We pay in Social Security. I mean, people are paying in money out of their salary. So why do you call that an entitlement? And I think of entitlements that we consider they should cut is things that are given away where there is no input from the person that's receiving. So what all covers?
Okay, well, entitlements is something you're entitled to. I mean, you've paid into Social Security. And as that article by Robert Samuelson kind of explains a little bit, is that you get back more than you pay into the system. So entitlement is just that you're entitled to it after you've paid into it. I mean, if you have buy a bond, you get paid interest on it. And Social Security, by the way, it says it doesn't cause anything cost to the deficit. And you got to be careful about a phrase like that, because Social Security, if you look at the cash going out for Social Security benefits and the cash coming in from the FICA tax, is a negative cash flow. Where you get a positive cash flow out of Social Security is there's a $2.5 trillion surplus sitting at the federal government that pays interest to Social Security. So if you count that interest flowing from those $2.5 trillion worth of government bonds, and that's how they end up getting a surplus. Now it's going to go into even negative cash flow before long. you know, the total national debt, about 4 or 5 trillion of it is owned by the federal government itself. And that's the reason, even though we may reach that debt ceiling sometime this month, they can kind of finesse things because they don't have to pay themselves cash as interest right now, too. But
What else, besides social, if you say you're entitled, I can see that, but I think of entitlement, we're throwing.
that's not the way they define entitlements. Entitlements is that, you know, in our country, once you're 65, you're entitled to Medicare.
All right. Well,
And we
what
paid
about-
into it,
Yeah,
but-
what about food stamps and other things people get money for and they don't pay taxes on?
Right. Well, that's it's still a different type of entitlement. You don't pay into it. I mean, so
Yeah.
there's certain entitlements that, you know.
Like what? What are certain entitlements?
Well, food stamps.
And what else?
Retirement for benefits to veterans. There's a. Let me
Okay.
look at my little list here.
Okay.
I mean, there's all that mandatory spending.
Yes.
There's a little chart there that shows unemployment compensation. If you get unemployed, you're entitled under our system of government to get unemployment insurance. The child nutrition program
Yes.
and food
The
stamps.
WIC.
If you qualify for an income level, you're entitled to it. So you have to qualify for them, and whether you qualify by age or qualify that you're very poor,
Yeah.
you become entitled to certain benefits under the law in our country.
Okay. I just recall hearing Ms. Star Parker, who spoke, and she's written a couple of books, one, Uncle Sam's Plantation, and she was really getting a lot of the entitlements when someone said, actually a pastor said to her, to the church congregation, if you're counting on the government, you should get up and get out and get a job. And so I think that's a message that's been missed. So,
Right.
okay, thank you.
Got time for another question or two? Or I may got everybody too confused already.
Yeah, you can ask another question. And I have one too.
Okay.
Again, it's from a book now.
Okay.
But the secret to managing government debt was to fund it properly by setting aside revenues at regular intervals to service interest and pay off principal. Alexander Hamilton. Now, how do we get away from that?
It's much easier to spend than to tax, and we can't tax ourselves out of this problem. And it's a spending problem. It's kind of like the Medicare Part D benefit. And Republicans were the ones that pushed that through with President Bush. So this is a bipartisan problem. Democrats and Republicans are equally responsible for this mess we're in right now. We just, it's easy to pass more benefits on, and you try to change them. That's what the fiscal cliff is forcing, is you got to make some decisions. And is it means testing part of it? Do we have to cut across the board spending? Agriculture subsidies and those programs all have to be on the table. And that's the reason a reconciliation as a one big package vote is what's going to make it happen next fall when they probably have that vote. If you had each of these individually up for a vote, no one would vote against Social Security or Medicare individually. But if it's a package deal and everybody's ox is gored, so to speak, hopefully you can get the 218 votes in the House. The key is the 218 votes in the House and how they do it. The Senate should be okay, and by not having the filibuster, they only need 51 Senate votes. The key is going to be how do they get the 218 votes, and that's still scratching my head on how to do that.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I have a question. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but you did say you were going to kind of talk about how you thought it could work out. If you were in Congress today, and I know you're glad you're not, and I, as your constituent, came up to visit you, and I said, Dan, I'm counting on you to take some leadership here because I trust you. I know you know what you're talking about. What would you advocate? How do you think this problem should be? Not how will it be solved, but what is the sensible thing to do?
Well, the politics of it is it's just a couple of people really making the decision. It's John Boehner and the leadership top leadership within the Republican House membership trying to negotiate something with President Obama right now. And so the rest of the members are just, what do I do here? I mean, surprisingly, an individual member, you don't have, as much influence as you think you do. You're just sitting around waiting and hurrying up. I've been there many a time late. I remember at Christmas time back in '95, that's when the government shut down. We went out and bought some Christmas decorations for our house in Washington because we were just kind of waiting around. Even though, so the decision is made by a small handful of people and John Boehner. And John Boehner can't demand 218 votes out of the House of Representatives. Now, what would be a sensible thing? It's hard to do something, I think, before the new Congress gets sworn in on January 3rd. And so that makes it even more difficult. From a Republican perspective, just go and get the tax rate increase off the table and save that fight, the rest of the fight on the budget to next year. The debt ceiling, President Obama's already talking about that. He said, I don't want to go through that again. It was a bad experience last summer. So he wants to get the debt ceiling resolved right away too. But there's got to be something to force Congress to act. And the debt ceiling is a must-pass piece of legislation. And that'll be up, let's say, next February or March. And at that time, they can agree to a budget set of numbers. And so they can agree to a certain amount of budget numbers that the Budget Committee can then work with. And then the details can be worked out by the Ways and Means Committee, the Commerce Committee, the Agriculture Committee, and all the committees of jurisdiction. That's how I think would work out. But they need to do something, they think, before January 1 or 2, even though it's a slope and they'd have some time. But the fight is going to be on this debt ceiling coming up again in February. The committees kind of, once they're given a number, will come up with a solution to it. The Agriculture Committee, if they're told to cut agriculture subsidy $5 billion a year, they will do it. But it's hard for the rest of Congress to force them to do it, and they can't do it without being forced into a reconciliation bill. So that's how the process is going to work. It's not going to be a pretty sight. It's going to be a roller coaster next year. I mean, we're going to have ups and downs. It's not going to be, something's going to be happy. We're going to see maybe a major fall of the stock market. If you remember back in 2008, the fall of 2008, when the recession hit, they had the TARP bill, and it was right before the election. The stock market, the House went past it, and the stock market collapsed 500 points in one day, and so they went back into session the next day and passed it. But a number of Republicans, lost their seat over that vote. So these are not easy votes to take that are anything to do with for a Republican to increase taxes or a Democrat to do anything with entitlements. And so the struggle is going to get those 218 votes. We've created a very polarized political environment now where, as I say, most people are elected in primaries, and as such they're more committed to the base of the parties, both sides, than trying to work out a compromise. The people from the middle are disappearing from Washington. And I didn't consider myself one in the middle. I was on middle on social issues, but on fiscal issues I was pretty right wing up there.
Not today, by today's.
Okay, well, no more questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was wonderful and very, very informative. I want to wish you all a wonderful holiday season. Enjoy your family, enjoy your friends, enjoy your many parties, enjoy everything that you do. Look forward to seeing you next year, February, second Thursday in February. Take care of yourselves.